Hi, I'm Ben, and welcome back to Stadium Stats. We'll be going over week 3 of the NFL this week, so let's get started. The first game on the week was the Giants 49ers, who played on Thursday Night Football. And going into this game, I was expecting a lot from the 49ers. They've shown a lot so far, and the Giants have been they haven't looked very good, to be honest, with the exception of the second half of that Cardinals game. But their first 3 halves of the season were not good at all. They were really bad. So I really was expecting a blowout win from the 49ers, and it pretty much was. It was 30-12 in favor of the 49ers. Looking at the stats, Daniel Jones was 22 of 32 passing for 140 yards, no touchdowns, and an interception. So he didn't play very great. They had almost no running game at all without Saquon Barkley, since Saquon has an injury. Matt Breida was 4 for 17 and a touchdown, and their second string running back, Gary Brightwell, was 4 for 5. So their running game never got going besides that rushing touchdown, which was their only touchdown of the week. They also barely got their receiving game going, as their leading receiver was Darius Slayton with 3 receptions for 32 yards, followed by Gary Brightwell for 2 for 31. Paris Campbell had a bunch of catches, but only 24 yards on 6 catches, and nobody had a receiving touchdown. Their defense didn't look good. They let up 30 points to the Niners. Kayvon Thibodeau did have a sack, but outside of that, their defense really did not look very good. Looking at the 49ers, though, Brock Purdy looked electric. He looked arguably like this was the best game of his year. He had 37 passing attempts, which was by far the most of the season, on 25 completions, over 300 yards, 2 touchdowns, again, no interceptions. He's just continuing to prove that despite being the last pick in the draft, he's going to look really good. Running-wise, Christian McCaffrey looked amazing yet again. He's still the league lead in rushing. He went 18 for 85 and a touchdown, with Elijah Mitchell backing him up, 11 for 42. Also looked pretty decent. Receiving-wise, Brandon Ayuk was injured this week, so Deebo Samuel led the charge, 6 for 129 and a touchdown. George Kittle also looked really good, stepping up in Ayuk's absence, 7 for 90. And Christian McCaffrey had a couple of receptions too. And the defense, they had Talanoa Hufanga, the safety for the 49ers, had an interception. They had a couple sacks between Nick Bosa having one and Javon Hargrave having one. And they only let up 12 points total to the Giants. So they looked pretty good on defense, which is no surprise. They've continued to look really dominant on defense, just like they did all of last year. The next game we'll look at was the Falcons-Detroit Lions game, where the Falcons lost 6-20. Desmond Ridder had 200 passing yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. The big surprise was on their combined 20 carries, they had less than 50 rushing yards, which for the Falcons is a big surprise because the Lions' defense is not very good typically, or at least they weren't last year. So people went into this year expecting some improvements, but not quite to this extent. But the Falcons' rushing game has looked unstoppable all season, and it looked not very good here. Bijan Robinson was 10 for 33. Tyler Algier was 7 for 12, and that was it. Receiving-wise, they also couldn't really get going. Their leading receiver was Kyle Pitts, 5 for 41. Jonnu Smith, their other tight end, was 5 for 37, and Drake London had 2 catches for 31. But they never really got going. Defensively, Jesse Bates had another interception. He had 2 in week 1. He has another one here off Jared Goff. That's now, surprisingly, 2 weeks in a row with Jared Goff throwing an interception, which, seeing as he has the third longest streak of no interceptions on passing attempts, it is surprising that he now 2 weeks in a row has thrown an interception. But looking at Jared Goff's stats more in depth, he was 22 of 33, 240 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. So nothing too spectacular, but he looked fine. Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery this week was injured, so Jahmyr Gibbs was the guy, and he went 17 for 80. No touchdowns, but looked pretty good on the ground. Receiving wise, Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to be that dominant receiver, 9 for 102. Sam Laporta, first tight end in NFL history to have 3 games in a row of 5+ receptions. He looks really, really good. 8 for 84 and a touchdown this week. Khalif Raymond, 4 for 55. And then defensively, they had a bunch of sacks. Aiden Hutchinson had 2. Charles Harris had 1. Jack Campbell, their rookie this year, has 1. Derek Barnes had 1. Aleem McNeil had 1. Benito Jones had 1. They really had a lot of sacks in this game. No interceptions, but their defense looks a lot better than people were giving them credit for going into the season. As well as many other people, thought that the Lions, yes, they added a few good pieces, but they were going to be relatively the same defense that they were last year, which was putrid, and they are proving otherwise this year. Moving on to our next game, we got the Chargers-Vikings. It was a battle of the two 0-2 teams, and statistically, it is very unlikely for teams to bounce back from an 0-3 start. So this game meant a lot. No team has started 0-3 and still made the playoffs. So the Chargers ended up coming out with the win here, 28-24, but it came down to the last minute with the Chargers having a near perfect offensive game. Justin Herbert was 40 of 47 passing. That's an 85% completion percentage for 400 yards, 3 touchdowns, and he still, after 3 games and 6 touchdowns, has yet to throw an interception on the season. The other surprising part in the passing game was Keenan Allen, their top receiver, had a massive pass for 49 yards and a touchdown to Mike Williams. Rushing-wise, they looked horrendous. To be fair, they were missing Austin Eckler, their number 1 running back. However, they really looked terrible running. Joshua Kelly was their lead rusher on 11 carries for 12 yards. No rushing touchdowns. They had a total of 30 rushing yards. They did really poorly in the rushing game, but they made up for it in the receiving game as Keenan Allen had 18 receptions for 200 yards. Mike Williams, 7 for 120 and a touchdown, which was, funny enough, thrown by his partner in crime, Keenan Allen. Unfortunately, Mike Williams in this win went down with an ACL tear and is out for the rest of the season, so that's really going to hurt the team. Joshua Palmer had 4 for 66 and a touchdown, and what I like to see is Quentin Johnston. He did have a couple grabs, only 2 for 10, but he only was in 25% of the snaps. And now that Mike Williams is down, I'm very curious to see what Quentin Johnston will be able to do at the number 2 or number 3 receiver role, depending on where they slot Joshua Palmer and Quentin Johnston in. But I'm very excited to see what this first round talent rookie has in store for the Chargers. Looking defensively, Kenneth Murray Jr. had an interception. Tuli Tuipulotu had a sack. Sebastian Joseph Day had a sack. Joey Bosa had a sack. Morgan Fox had a sack. And honestly, I don't know if this is chopped up more to the Chargers defense or more of the poor O-line of the Vikings, because the Chargers defense hasn't been that good. But 5 sacks, they looked pretty decent this week. Looking at the Vikings, Kirk Cousins is playing. It's hard to say this when a team is 0-3, but Kirk Cousins is playing at an MVP level. He went 32 for 50 for 370 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception. He's just looked really good in all 3 games, and he has not been the problem. The problem has been the turnovers through fumbling. There have been a lot of fumbles for this team between 3 games. Multiple fumbles in every single game, or multiple turnovers in every single game. And a couple of those have been interceptions from Kirk. But even in a week where he had 0 interceptions last week, there were still multiple turnovers. But what was nice to see on the Vikings offense was they actually had the running game get going this week. They looked really, really poor with a total of 70 rushing yards in the past 2 weeks. This week, Alexander Mattison was 20 for 93. Still didn't have any rushing touchdowns this week, but 20 for 93 is pretty decent given where they were at before. Receiving-wise, Justin Jefferson almost had 3 games in a row of 150 receiving yards. 1 yard shy, 7 for 149 and a touchdown. TJ Hawkinson looked electric, 8 for 78. Jordan Addison, their rookie, 6 for 52. And KJ Osborne had 1 big touchdown grab for 36 yards. Defensively, they really didn't look that good. Danielle Hunter continues to look really good. He did have a sack, but outside of him, their defense just lets up too many points and keeps them out of games because their offense can keep firing. But their defense is keeping them out of games because they're letting up so many points. Looking at the next game, and this was a weird one. We've got the New Orleans Saints versus the Green Bay Packers. The Green Bay Packers, going into the fourth quarter, were down 17-0 and ended up coming out with an 18-17 victory. Looking at the stats, Derek Carr was playing really well, 13 for 18, 100 yards and a touchdown before he got taken out with a shoulder injury, where Jameis Winston just could not take his place. Jameis Winston, 10 for 16, 100 yards, no touchdowns. He didn't look bad per se, but the offense was a lot less explosive. They didn't put up any points with Jameis Winston at all, and part of that was the fault of their kicker, who missed a field goal. But Jameis Winston just couldn't get the job done. Looking at their rushing game, they were missing their top 2 rushers. Alvin Kamara still serving time on that suspension. It was his last week being suspended. And Jamal Williams was put on IR. So their leading rusher was Kendre Miller and Tony Jones with 9 and 8 carries for 30 yards each. They didn't look very good. Receiving-wise, Chris Olave continues to look explosive, continues to look really, really good. 8 for 104. Michael Thomas, as their number 2 receiver, continues to look pretty good. Only thing that they've got to worry about with him is injuries, but he continues to play pretty well when he is on the field. 6 for 50. And defensively, they looked super good for the first 3 quarters. They let up 0 points. They had Alontae Taylor with a sack. They had Lonnie Johnson with an interception. But then in the fourth quarter, the Packers just could not be stopped. They put up 18 unanswered points. And while that is at fault of the offense, that is more so the fault of the defense of the New Orleans Saints. Looking at the Packers offense, however, Jordan Love threw an interception. I believe that was his first of the season. He went 22 of 44, 50% completion percentage, not very good. 260 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Rushing-wise, Aaron Jones was missing again. So Jordan Love was actually their leading rusher with 9 for 39 and a touchdown, followed by A.J. Dillon, 11 for 33. They really couldn't get the running game going besides Jordan Love's rushing touchdown. Their passing game looked a lot better this week. They were once again missing Christian Watson, still yet to play a game this season, but Romeo Doubs looked really good in his place, 5 for 73 and a touchdown. Jaden Reed, their rookie receiver, looked really good, had a crazy grab. He went 3 for 63. Luke Musgrave, their rookie tight end, went 6 for 49, and Dontavian Wicks went 4 for 45. And their defense, Rashawn Gary had three sacks, and Kenny Clark had 1. But they let up 17 points in the beginning of the game to Derek Carr, who hadn't looked that good. The Saints offense hadn't looked that good through the first 2 weeks. So it was a little surprising, but that defense really shut down Jameis Winston, especially in the fourth quarter. The Saints put up no points at all. And that was partly due to how dominant the Packers defense looked in that fourth quarter, or in that second half as a whole. Looking at the next game, we got a big upset. The Houston Texans taking a win 37-17 over the Jacksonville Jaguars. Going into the season, these two teams, same division. It was expected that the Jaguars were going to come away with this division, no problem. And right now, the Colts are actually in first in this division at 2-1, followed by all 3 of the other teams, the Texans, the Jaguars, and the Titans, all at 1-2. The Texans got their first win this week. C.J. Stroud, 3rd game in a row with no interceptions. He now has set a record for the most passing attempts by a rookie quarterback without throwing an interception. He went 20 of 30 for 280 yards and 2 touchdowns. He continues to look really good. Honestly, like the best quarterback in that draft. It's still really early to say, so I'm not going to take too much away from that. But so far, he has looked the best. Devin Singletary, rushing-wise, was their leading rusher, 9 for 41. Dameon Pierce looked kind of mediocre at best, if not actually pretty bad. He was 14 for 31, but the only redeeming quality he had was he did have a rushing touchdown. And then receiving-wise, no one really could get going. Nico Collins, 2 for 34. Robert Woods, 3 for 34. Except for Tank Dell, their rookie from a third-round pick. No one was expecting too much from him, and he looked amazing this week. He looked great last week with 85 yards and a touchdown. This week, even better, 5 for 145 and a touchdown. Got wide open on a pass, on a massive touchdown that sealed the game for them. And all in all, he looks like he was a real big steal in that draft. But the bigger surprise was the Texans' defense only letting up 17 points to the Jaguars, which, looking at the Jaguars' performance against the Chiefs, looks like it makes sense, seeing as the Chiefs only put up 9 against the Jaguars only put up 9 against the Chiefs. However, the Texans were supposed to have a really bad defense, and the Jaguars were supposed to have a really explosive offense. And the Jaguars didn't score until the second half. They had 0 points going into halftime. So, all in all, the Texans' defense looked a lot better. The Jaguars on offense, Trevor Lawrence, 27 of 40, 280 yards, a touchdown and an interception. He didn't look that good, which is a big surprise because everyone had these huge expectations, maybe even MVP expectations for Trevor Lawrence going into his third year. And he has yet to prove anything this year. Receiving-wise, running-wise, Travis Etienne looked pretty good, 19 for 88. Tank Bigsby did have a rushing touchdown, but they weren't crazy running-wise, but Travis Etienne looked pretty good. Receiving-wise, though, Evan Engram had 7 for 67. Christian Kirk was 4 for 54 and a touchdown. And the big surprise is that Calvin Ridley has yet to repeat his performance from week 1, where he had over 100 yards. Last week he looked mediocre. This week he looked mediocre again, 3 for 40. But Travis Etienne did have 4 for 50. And Jamal Agnew, a surprise, came up with 4 for 50 yards as well. And their defense looked horrendous. They let up 37 points to the Texans, who had one of the worst scoring offenses of all last year. So it really is a bad look for the Jaguars. It's just a big surprise. Moving on to the next game, and what is definitely the weirdest game of the week, we've got the Broncos versus the Dolphins. This game ended in a Broncos loss 20-70. That is the most points scored since 1960s. The 1960s, the most in the Super Bowl era, 70 points. The Dolphins put up. They played amazing. They had 10 touchdowns. They could not be stopped. Tua, 23 of 26, 300 yards, 4 touchdowns. Even their backup quarterback, Mike White, came into the game because the game was such a blowout. Had 2 attempts, 2 completions, 67 yards, and a touchdown. Even their backup couldn't be stopped. And when you think that's crazy, their rushing game was even better. Raheem Mostert started off the game looking electric. He was 13 for 82 and 3 rushing touchdowns, as well as 7 for 60 receiving and another score. So he had 4 touchdowns. But then they started handing the ball off to their rookie running back, Devon Achane. He's super small, fell to the third round in the draft this year because of his size, but he's super explosive due to his immense speed. He broke off for 2 massive touchdowns. He went 18 for 200 yards. That's 11 yards a carry. Had 2 rushing touchdowns, as well as 4 for 30 receiving and 2 more scores. Both of their running backs had four touchdowns each. Tyreek Hill in the receiving game also looked unstoppable. 9 for 157 and a touchdown. Chosen Anderson had a major touchdown, 1 for 68 and a touchdown. And this was all in spite of Jalen Waddle missing this week with an injury. They still put up 70 points without their second best offensive player. Looking at the Broncos, or looking at the Dolphins defense, Emmanuel Ogbah had an interception and a sack. And outside of that, their defense, the Broncos put up 20 points, but their defense was which for the Broncos isn't that bad. But their defense was guaranteed to give up more points because of how much the Dolphins were scoring. The Broncos were given the ball so many times due to the nonstop scoring of the Dolphins that you really can't hold that against the Dolphins' defense. Looking at the Broncos' offense, Russell Wilson, he played fine, 23 of 38, 300 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Their running game never really got going. Javonte Williams was 11 for 42, and Jaleel McLaughlin was 5 for 15. But their receiving game looked pretty decent. Courtland Sutton was 8 for 91 and a touchdown. Jerry Jeudy, 5 for 81. And Marvin Mims, their rookie, had another really good week, 3 for 73. He also had a kick return touchdown late in the game. So, actually, the Dolphins' defense did even better than it appears because 7 of the Broncos' 20 points were from special teams. Looking at their defense, there's not much to say here besides they were horrendous. No sacks, no interceptions, no forced fumbles, and they allowed up 70 points. Again, that is the most points since the 1960s. The Broncos defense, who looked so good last year, just could not look even competent this week. And it really shows because that was supposed to be the strong suit of this team. Moving on to the next game, this one was a bit of a snooze fest. The Tennessee Titans got taken down by the Cleveland Browns, 27-3. For the Titans, Ryan Tannehill was 13 of 25 for 100 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. The big surprise was the Browns completely stopped the run. Derrick Henry was stopped 11 for 20 yards, no touchdowns. That's 1.8 yards a carry. Their backup running back, 4 for 6, 1.5 yards a carry, no rushing touchdowns. That is the least amount of yards that I can remember the Titans having in forever. Derrick Henry always looks really good, and he looked human. The Browns really made the most of their rush defense and made the Titans look pedestrian. Receiving wise, they really didn't make up for it either. DeAndre Hopkins was their leading receiver at 3 for 48. Chris Moore, 2 for 41, and no one else had even double-digit yards. Defensively, they did have a couple sacks. Roger McCreary had a sack. Azeez Al-Shire had a sack. Danico Autry had a sack. But they did let up 27 points to the Browns, and let Deshaun Watson look good, which was the first time Deshaun Watson had looked good as a member of the Browns. Deshaun Watson this week was 27 of 33, 289 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Rushing-wise, they didn't get a ton of yards, but Jerome Ford did have a rushing touchdown. Again, they are missing Nick Chubb now and for the rest of the season. Really upset to see him gone, but I'm sure Jerome Ford will start to look better in future weeks as he gets more acclimated to being the guy in this offense. Kareem Hunt did have a couple rushes, 5 for 13. I'm sure he'll get better as he gets more acclimated to being back on the team as well. Receiving-wise, they looked really good. Amari Cooper, 7 for 116 and a touchdown. He even had a touchdown called back because the whistle got blown early on a play, and he still looked that good. Elijah Moore, 9 for 49. Donovan Peoples-Jones, 3 for 49. And then defensively, Myles Garrett had 3.5 sacks. 3.5. Alex Wright also had a sack, and Ogbania Okoronkwo also had half a sack with Myles Garrett. But that game was a complete blowout. It was never close, nor was the next one, Bills-Commanders. This game was even less close. The Buffalo Bills won this game 37-3. Josh Allen threw 20 for 32, 218 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Nothing too special. But their run game looked really, really good this week, which, knowing the Bills and how their offense tends to operate, typically the Bills are a pass-first team. But this week, they had 15 carries for 98 yards for James Cook at 6.5 yards a carry. Josh Allen also ran 3 times for 46 yards and a touchdown. And Latavius Murray also had a rushing touchdown. Their run game looked more than competent. It looked very good this week. And then receiving-wise, they didn't light up either because Stephon Diggs had 8 for 111, as well as Gabe Davis having one big catch for 35 yards and a touchdown. But behind him, they really do not have any other guys in this offense. They couldn't get Dalton Kincaid going, their rookie tight end. He only had 2 catches for 3 yards. And behind Gabe Davis and Stephon Diggs, they don't really have any other good receivers on this team. And Gabe Davis, even at that, is very inconsistent. Looking defensively, though, Terrell Bernard had an interception and 2 sacks. Tre'Davious White had an interception. Ed Oliver had a sack and a half. Leonard Floyd had 2 sacks. Greg Rousseau had a sack. Daquan Jones had a sack and a half. Micah Hyde had an interception. AJ Epinesa had an interception, returned for a touchdown as well as a sack. They had a combined 9 sacks and 4 interceptions, including 1 return for a pick 6. Their defense just looked unstoppable. Looking at the Commanders, they only put up 3 points. Sam Howell had a terrible game, 19 for 29, 170 yards, no touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. Rushing-wise, they actually looked really good. Brian Robinson, 10 for 70 for 7 yards a carry. Sam Howell had a rush for 18 yards, and Antonio Gibson, 2 for 17. But they had to abandon the run so early because they were down so big. Looking at the receiving game, Curtis Samuel was their leading receiver, 2 receptions for 54 yards, followed by Terry McLaurin at 6 receptions for 41 yards. They never really got going on offense, and it's to no surprise when you lose 3-37 that the offense looked that pitiful. Kendall Fuller did pick off Josh Allen, but defensively they still looked really poor as they let up 37 total points. Looking at the next game, we've got the Colts-Ravens, which was the only overtime game of the week, where the Colts came out with a surprise victory, 22-19 over the Ravens. The Colts this week, they were missing Anthony Richardson, who was out with a concussion, but Gardner Minshew played well in his absence, 27 of 44, 230 yards and a touchdown, no interceptions. Rushing-wise, Zach Moss looked pretty good, 30 rushes for 122 yards, 4 yards a carry. Receiving-wise, Michael Pittman looked really good, 9 for 77. Josh Downs, their rookie receiver that they drafted this year, looked really good, 8 for 57. Alec Pierce, their rookie receiver from last year, also had 3 for 43. And Zach Moss did have a receiving touchdown as well. Defensively, Zaire Franklin had a sack, Samson Ebukam had a sack, Kwity Paye had a sack, Taven Bryan had a sack. They didn't have any interceptions off Lamar, but they did have 4 sacks for the whole defense. Looking at the Ravens, Lamar Jackson went 22 of 31 for 200 yards, no touchdowns, but no interceptions. He did rush for 2 touchdowns, though. Lamar Jackson was explosive. He was so good on the ground. He was 14 for 101 yards and 2 touchdowns. Gus Edwards also looked pretty good, 11 rushes for 51 yards, and Melvin Gordon had 10 for 32. Looking at the receiving game, they never really got going too well. Zay Flowers, their rookie receiver, continues to look really good. 8 receptions, but only 48 yards, 6 yards a catch. That's not that good, but he was open a lot. Nelson Aguilar, 4 for 39. Mark Andrews, nothing too special, 4 for 35. And then defensively, Kyle Hamilton, their second-year safety, looked amazing. He had 3 sacks just by himself. Roquan Smith and Jadeveon Clowney also combined for another sack. So both teams here looked pretty good on both sides of the ball. They both had 4 sacks on defense. They both put up a similar amount of points. It was a pretty close game, and it did end up going into overtime. So, yeah. Looking at the next game, we've got the New England Patriots versus the New York Jets. And this game was a snooze fest. Patriots won 15-10. Looking at the Patriots offense, Mac Jones was 15 for 29, 200 yards and a touchdown. Rushing-wise, they had a lot of rushing attempts between Ezekiel Elliott and Ramondre Stevenson. Ezekiel Elliott was 16 rushes for 80 yards. Ramondre Stevenson, 19 rushes for 59 yards. Receiving-wise, Pharaoh Brown was 2 for 71 and a touchdown, which I don't think anybody expected Pharaoh Brown to be their leading receiver. But then their second best receiver, yet again, was Kendrick Bourne, 4 for 46. and no one else really got going too well. Defensively, they looked really good. They only let up 10 points, but it was against Zach Wilson as a quarterback. They also had a couple sacks. Matthew Judon had 2 sacks. Christian Barrymore had 1 sack. Looking at the Jets' offense, Zach Wilson, again, looked really bad. Not quite as bad as last week. He didn't have any interceptions, but he had a 50% completion rate for only 160 yards and no touchdowns. Rushing-wise, I don't think anybody expected them to be as bad as they were. Breece Hall, 12 rushes, 18 yards, and Dalvin Cook, 8 rushes for 18 yards. That's a combined 20 rushes for 36 yards. That's really, really, really bad. Receiving, which I guess isn't that big of a surprise since it is the Patriots defense, but everyone thought that Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook as a running back duo, especially now that Zach Wilson's the starter, we're going to get a lot of work and we're going to be really effective. But because Zach Wilson is the starting quarterback and it's not Aaron Rodgers, teams can stack the box against their running backs and plan for them to be running the ball because the Jets clearly do not trust Zach Wilson, rightfully so, to be passing too often. Receiving wise, Garrett Wilson was 5 for 48. Allen Lazard was 3 for 39. They didn't have any receiving touchdowns. Defensively, they looked fine, but they only let up 15 points, but they didn't have any sacks. They didn't have any interceptions. So nothing too much of note for that Jets defense, which is supposed to be so good. Our next game was the Panthers-Seahawks. Panthers fall to 0-3. They lost 27-37. They were missing Bryce Young, their rookie quarterback, who was drafted first overall. He's out with an ankle injury, so Andy Dalton took his place. Andy Dalton actually looked really good. He was 34 for 58, 360 yards and 2 touchdowns to no interceptions. Their running game never really got going, though. Miles Sanders was 9 for 24 yards and 1 touchdown. Receiving-wise, Adam Thielen had quite a turn. He turned back the time in this game. He went 11 for 145 yards and a touchdown. DJ Shark also looked really good, 4 for 86 and a touchdown. Miles Sanders did have a couple grabs, and Terrace Marshall also a couple grabs for 35 yards apiece. Looking at their defense, Brian Burns had a nice sack. Deion Jones had an interception. Yetur Gross-Matos had a sack. Looking at the Seahawks, their offense was so explosive. The Panthers are supposed to have a better defense than that. They shouldn't be letting up 37 points. Geno Smith, 23 for 36, 300 yards, 1 touchdown to 1 interception. So nothing too crazy. But rushing-wise, Kenneth Walker was 18 for 97 and 2 touchdowns. Zach Charbonnet, their other running back, the rookie from this year, went 9 for 46. Receiving-wise, DK Metcalf had a great game, 6 for 112. Tyler Lockett, you can't really say the same. He was only 3 for 34. And Jackson Smith-Njigba was only 1 for 10. Jake Bobo did have a touchdown himself. And looking at their defense, the Seahawks, Jordan Brooks had half a sack. Jaron Reed had a sack and a half. And Boye Mafe had a sack. But no interceptions off Andy Dalton. Looking at our next game, we have what was expected to be a complete blowout. The Chicago Bears versus the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chicago Bears fall to 0-3. Kansas City Chiefs, the reigning Super Bowl champions, now 2-1. They won 41-10 in this game, and it wasn't even that close. The Bears didn't score points until the fourth quarter. All 10 of those points were garbage time points, and the Chiefs actually went into halftime with 34 points, up 34-0. Looking at the individual stats, Justin Fields played pretty bad. He was 11 for 22, 99 yards, a touchdown to 1 interception. He also ran the ball 11 times for 47 yards. Roshan Johnson was the team's leading running back, 8 rushes for 38 yards. Khalil Herbert was 7 for 31. And receiving-wise, DJ Moore was the only one with anything of note. He was 3 for 41 and a touchdown. Again, that touchdown was in garbage time, however, against the Chiefs' second team defense. Looking at defense, Jack Sanborn did have an interception, and so did Quindell Johnson, but those were not off Patrick Mahomes. Those were both off of Blaine Gabbert, their backup, so it really doesn't say that much. Looking at the Chiefs offense, Patrick Mahomes had an amazing game, 24 for 33, 272 yards and 3 touchdowns. Blaine Gabbert played really bad, but again, he's the backup quarterback. He only came in because it was such a blowout to begin with. He was 3 for 5 for 30 yards and 2 interceptions. Their running game looked fine. Isaiah Pacheco had 15 carries for 62 yards and a touchdown. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had 15 carries for 55 yards and a touchdown. Looking at the receiving game, Travis Kelce's back. He had 7 catches, 69 yards and a touchdown. They also had Rashee Rice, their rookie receiver, have 5 catches for 59 yards. He looked pretty good. And Justin Watson also had 2 grabs for 51 yards. And then defensively, they had Mike Edwards have an interception off Justin Fields. Chris Jones had a sack. George Karlaftis had half a sack. And so did Drew A. Tranquill. And Mike Dana also had a sack. Looking at our next game, though, we've got the Cowboys-Cardinals. And this was a big surprise. Big upset. The Cardinals. Everyone's expecting the Cardinals to be this team that's tanking this year. Or even if they're not tanking, they're not going to be that competitive. They're not going to win many games. And yet, after weeks 1 and 2 being super competitive in both of those games and it coming down to the wire, the Cardinals actually won this game. Which is especially surprising given that the Cowboys had seemed to be one of the most dominant teams in football. They had let up 10 points in 2 weeks and had scored 70 points for a point differential of 60. I even had put them at my number 1 in my power rankings last week. Well, they just played really poorly. Dak Prescott, 25 of 40, 250 yards and 1 touchdown to 1 really bad interception. It was his first interception of the year, so I'll spare him, but it was a really bad interception and it cost them any chance of coming back into the game. Rushing, Tony Pollard looked amazing, 23 for 122 yards. That's 5.3 yards a carry. Dak Prescott also had a nice 3 for 24 yards, including a really nice rush for a first down late in the game. Receiving-wise, their surprise leader in receiving work was Michael Gallup, who was 6 for 92 yards. CeeDee Lamb came in at second, 4 for 53, and Jake Ferguson, their tight end, had 5 for 48. Rico Dowdle also did have a receiving touchdown. Defensively, DeMarcus Lawrence had a sack. Micah Parsons, as always, had a sack. But they let up 28 points to the Arizona Cardinals, who are led by Joshua Dobbs. And Joshua Dobbs actually looked pretty competent this week, which I think says a lot about the Cowboys' defense and how inconsistent they are. Because, yet again, I'll reiterate the point. They let up a total of 10 points, 0 to the Giants and 10 to the Jets. And then they let up 28 to the Cardinals. So this was a really poor performance by the Cowboys' defense. Looking at the Cardinals' offense, Joshua Dobbs was 17 for 21 for 190 yards and a touchdown. James Conner looked really good on the ground, 14 for 98 and a touchdown. Joshua Dobbs also did have 6 rushes for 55 yards. And Rondale Moore, their receiver, had 3 rushes for 54 yards and a touchdown. Receiving-wise, Michael Wilson was their leading receiver with 2 receptions for 86 yards. Marquise Brown was not too far behind him, 5 receptions, 61 yards and a touchdown. And no one else really got going in the receiving game. Defensively, Kaiser White had a really clutch interception at the end of the game. Victor Dimukeje had a sack. So did Zaven Collins. And their defense only let up 16 points to the Cowboys, which, all things considered, given the roster that the Cardinals have, is not that bad. Looking at the next game, we've got the Pittsburgh Steelers, who beat the Las Vegas Raiders 23-18. Kenny Pickett had 16 for 28, 235 yards and 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. Rushing-wise, they yet again had a poor yards per carry. Najee Harris, 19 rushes for 65 yards. Jaylen Warren, 8 for 29, each having about 3.5 yards a carry. Receiving-wise, George Pickens yet again was their leading receiver, with Deontay Johnson missing time still due to injury, the injury he sustained in week 1. So George Pickens continues being the number 1 receiver, and is doing really well at it. 4 receptions, 75 yards. Calvin Austin also had 2 receptions for 72 yards and a touchdown, and Pat Freiermuth had 3 receptions for 41 yards and a touchdown. And then defensively, they had 3 interceptions off Jimmy Garoppolo. Levi Wallace had 2 of them, and Patrick Peterson having the other. And also, TJ Watt had 2 sacks, and Marcus Golden and Keanu Benton each had 1. Looking at the Raiders, Jimmy Garoppolo had a poor game. 28 for 44, 324 yards, 2 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. Rushing-wise, Josh Jacobs a little bit more on pace, but still not very good. Only 3.5 yards a carry, 17 for 62. Receiving-wise, Davante Adams had a monster game, 13 for 172 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jacoby Myers also continues looking really good at that receiver 2 role right behind Adams, had 7 grabs for 85 yards. And then defensively, they didn't look very good. The Steelers have struggled all season to put any points up on offense, and they didn't really struggle nearly as much this week. They still only put up 23 points, but that's a lot more than they had been in the past weeks. Max Crosby did have a sack, but that was the only noteworthy tally for the Raiders defense. And then looking at our 2 Monday Night Football games, we'll start off with the Eagles facing the Buccaneers. Jalen Hurts and the Eagles won 25-11 this week. Jalen Hurts was 23 of 37, 277 yards with 1 touchdown to 2 interceptions. So he didn't play very well. Rushing wise though, they played amazing. DeAndre Swift was their leading rusher. He had 16 carries for 130 yards. That's 8 yards a carry, of which 100 of those 130 yards actually came from before any contact. So what that means is the running back had 100 yards before any player had ever made contact with him between all of his carries, which goes to show just how dominant the Eagles' offensive line is, because the only way the yards before contact come is from a well-performing offensive line. Kenneth Gainwell also ran 14 for 43, a lot less efficient at only 3 yards a carry. Jalen Hurts also ran 10 for 28 at 3 yards a carry as well, but he did have a rushing score. Receiving-wise, their leading receiver was A.J. Brown. He had a really nice bounce-back game after kind of not showing up as much over the past 2 weeks. He was 9 receptions for 130 yards, no touchdowns. Olamide Zaccheaus came in big, 2 for 58 yards and a touchdown. Dallas Goedert had 5 for 41 yards, and Devontae Smith, kind of a poor game, at 4 for 28 yards. Defensively, Reed Blankenship had an interception. Marlon Tuipulotu had a sack. Jalen Carter, their rookie, who they drafted in the first round, had half a sack, combined with Fletcher Cox, who also had half a sack. And then looking at the Buccaneers, Baker Mayfield played pretty poorly. 15 for 25, 150 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. That was their first turnover of the year, though. They were the last team to turn the ball over. Looking at their rushing game was really poor, which is not a surprise against the Eagles' dominant defensive line. But Rachaad White was 14 for 38 at less than 3 yards a carry. And their receiving game didn't make up for it, because Mike Evans was their leading receiver with 5 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown, followed by Chris Godwin, 3 for 32, and Rachaad White was the only other player with multiple catches and double-digit yards at 3 catches for 24 yards. Defensively, they played all right. Levante David had a sack, Devin White and D. Delaney both had an interception, but nothing too much of note. They did let up 25 points, but it is the Eagles. It just was a surprise seeing 2 interceptions off of Jalen Hurts, so I'll give props to the Buccaneers defense for that. And then our other game on Monday night was a Super Bowl rematch from a couple years back. The Los Angeles Rams facing the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals finally getting their first win, 19-16 over the Rams. Matthew Stafford played pretty poorly. He was 18 for 33, 270 yards and a touchdown to 2 interceptions. Rushing-wise, Kyren Williams couldn't get it going. He was 10 for 38. Tutu Atwell also had 1 rush for 22 yards. Receiving-wise, they were a lot less efficient than they were in weeks past. However, Puka Nacua continues to be really, really good, especially given that he was a 5th-round rookie this year. But he had 5 for 72 yards. Tyler Higbee also had 5 for 71 yards. And Tutu Atwell had 4 catches for 50 yards and a touchdown. Defensively, they put up a good fight. They held the Bengals to only 19 points. Aaron Donald had a sack. Byron Young had half a sack. And Kobe Turner had half a sack. Ahkello Witherspoon also did have an interception. Looking at the Bengals, however, Joe Burrow was playing this game injured. He does have a calf injury. He wasn't able to move around as well as he normally is. He had in this game, he was 26 of 49 for 260 yards. No touchdowns and 1 interception passing. Rushing-wise, Joe Mixon looked fine. He was 19 for 65, 3.5 yards a carry with 1 touchdown. But the real highlight was Ja'Marr Chase. This receiving game finally got going to an extent. Ja'Marr Chase had his best game of the season so far, 12 receptions, 141 yards. Tyler Boyd also looked pretty good, 5 receptions for 39 yards. What the big surprise is that T. Higgins still has yet to get going this season. Being that one of the most dominant number 2 receivers in the league, it is a little surprising that he only had 2 catches for 21 yards in this game, which goes along with how he's been playing all season. Looking at their defense, Daxton Hill and Sam Hubbard both had a sack. B.J. Hill also had a sack. So did D.J. Reader. Trey Hendrickson had 2 sacks. And Logan Wilson had 2 interceptions. So their defense did look really good. They were the first defense to really shut this Rams offense down, which everyone thought was going to be really poor going into the season, and just hasn't been. So props to the Bengals defense, but their offense needs to get going besides Ja'Marr Chase. All right, let's get into my Week 3 power rankings. And it's going to look a bit different this week. My number 1 team from last week, the Dallas Cowboys, are my number 10 this week. They looked so unbelievably good in the first 2 weeks, and I cannot take that away from them. But the fact that they lost to the Cardinals, and it was more than a 1-score game as well, the Cardinals being one of the worst teams in the league roster-wise, it just goes to show how inconsistent this Cowboys team is and how inconsistent that defense is going to continue to be. Looking at number 9, I've got the Ravens. They did lose this week, falling to 2-1. However, it was a really close game and went into overtime. It was very well fought. And the Ravens have continued to look good on both sides of the ball. While they did lose, I can't discredit them too much. It was a really close game. Number 8, I've got the Seahawks. They proved this week that they can get their offense going in any way. They can run the ball. They can pass the ball. Their defense looks fine. It's not nearly as much of an issue as it was last year. Last year, their offense was super explosive, but their defense just could not hold teams to few points. Well, they've been doing a bit better at that this year, and the Seahawks put up 37 this week. They looked really good on offense. Kenneth Walker looks really good. Their receivers look really good. They have arguably a top 5 receiving core in the entire league. Geno Smith continues to look good. I like where the Seahawks are at this year. Number 7, I've got the Lions. They won in Week 1 against the Chiefs, and then followed it up with a bad loss last week, but they're righting the ship by beating the Falcons this week 20-3. The biggest thing I like to see from the Lions was the dominance they had on defense. We know the Lions can play football on offense. They have an explosive offense. And while it hasn't been as good as it was all of the second half of last year, which I'm hoping to see it go back to, their offense is still putting up a good amount of points. But their defense is looking way better this year. So much better. They had arguably one of the worst defenses in the league last year, and it's not that anymore. They let up only 3 points to the Falcons and really shut down that rushing game that no other team has been able to figure out how to shut down. So I think the Lions have a good future, especially if they can get their offense firing again, just how they had at the end of last season. And at number 6, I've got the Cleveland Browns. Last week, had a really bad loss to the Steelers, lost Nick Chubb for the season. things weren't looking good. But in weeks 1 and 3, they've held their opponents to 3 points each, being the Titans and the Bengals. And the Browns have continued to put up a good amount of points, especially this week on offense. This was the most explosive their offense has looked, and the best Deshaun Watson has looked since going to that team. And while I'm not a fan of Deshaun Watson, he looked like a decent quarterback this week, which is more than the Browns could say in past weeks. Will he live up to that major contract that they paid him a couple years back? That is yet to be seen, and given how he's played up until this point, probably not. But this was a good sign that he could go back to that player he was on the Houston Texans, and that defense continues to be dominant. In at number 5, I've got the Kansas City Chiefs. Again, they fell to the Lions in week 1, but have since righted their ship. They have gotten both Travis Kelce and Chris Jones back, which has helped their team immensely. They just put up 41 points on the Bears. They look a lot better, but I can't put them any higher because the skill of the team they were playing, the Chicago Bears, still seems to be one of the worst teams in the league, so I don't know how much it really says about them, but they continue to look good. In at number 4, I've got the Buffalo Bills. They also had a very dominant game. Their defense had 4 interceptions. They won 37-3. This was week 1, Josh Allen looked poor. They lost to the Jets. And then last week was their get-right game against the Raiders. And Josh Allen played amazing. This week, Josh Allen didn't even play that amazing, and they still destroyed thanks to their defense and their running game, which is more than they've been able to say in past years with Josh Allen, because they've rarely had a running game. In at number 3, I've got the Philadelphia Eagles. This is the first team that I'm covering that's an undefeated team. I've got all 3 undefeated teams as my top 3 because they've all continued to look good week in and week out. But the Eagles have looked the poorest of those 3. The Eagles committed a few turnovers this week. Their offense is a lot less explosive, but their defense continues to put other teams down. The Buccaneers looked horrendous against this defense. They look a lot better than they did in week 1 against the Patriots, where their defense let up a decent amount of points against a Patriots team that doesn't have that good of an offense. So the Eagles seem to be righting their ship as well. Not that they lost any games, but they're righting the wrongs from those previous wins. In at number 2, I've got the San Francisco 49ers. Again, they continue to look like the most powerful team all around. All things considered, they have a dominant passing game. They have the league's leading rusher. They have a dominant defense. Their quarterback doesn't make a ton of mistakes and doesn't turn the ball over very much. They have, on paper, one of the best teams you could imagine. However, I could not put the Dolphins at number 1. The Dolphins just put up a record-setting amount of points. They put up 70 points, 50-point differential between them and their opponent. They looked unstoppable. They scored 10 touchdowns. They did not punt at all. They could have even put up more points. They could have put up 73. They elected not to kick a field goal, even though that field goal would have made them have the all-time record in points, as the current record is 72. But despite this offense looked unstoppable, and their defense looked really good as well. Their running game, which was a big concern last year, their running game couldn't get going, but this year, their running game is just as explosive as their passing game. Devon Achane, Raheem Mostert, both look super explosive, both look really unstoppable. Tyreek Hill continues to look unstoppable, and they did all of this without their second receiver and arguably second best player in Jalen Waddle. I'm so excited to see what the Dolphins have in future weeks. I can't wait to see more of Tua's MVP showing statistically. And yeah, that's about it for this week. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll catch you guys next week. Peace.